Like most of y'all, I'm sure, well, some of y'all, Jessica and I, we tend to binge watch shows on Netflix or some kind of streaming service. And we recently finished a show. It was a historical drama, which I tend to be a sucker for anything historical when it comes to whether it be historical fiction or historical nonfiction. I'm very interested in that. And so we came across this one that's a historical drama called Turn. And it's about the Culper spy ring during the American Revolutionary War. And so it's based, it's historical fiction, so meaning it's based on something that's happened, but they make a few changes to keep the story going. But a simple summary kind of the show, I promise not to give you any spoilers, is that you've got this cabbage farmer named Samuel Woodhull who goes by the name Culper, and he is a spy for General George Washington, and he's got several other people that work with him, help him get information from the British back to General Washington. And throughout the series, him and several other recruits, they are spies, like I said, for this spy ring, and they turn against the British and become spies, thus the title Turn. They turn against the British and become spies. And some of them, throughout this series, have this internal conflict about going against what they know or going against what their family supports, that going against the British is not the social norm, or that's not what your family would want, or sticking with the status quo, turning against the status quo. And so it's more about people going down one path, but then turning away from it and going down another path. And so it's much more than just, turning against the redcoats, but more turning against maybe some kind of personal philosophy that you once held and recognizing that that was wrong and going against it. And which, if you think about it, is kind of a strong Christian concept. So many times when I'm speaking to the teens, we talk through the classic 6 steps of salvation. You've got hear, believe, repent, confess, be baptized, live faithfully. And we come to repent. And I ask them, what does repent mean? And the definition, I kind of grill it into their head, is repenting is doing a 180. That you turn around, where you're going one way, and then you do a 180 and you turn around, and ideally in a Christian context, you turn back towards God. That you are walking towards a life of sin, or you are walking away from God, you do a 180 and you turn back and you start going back towards God. You start pursuing a life or relationship with God. And so tonight, what I want us to focus on briefly is a text that talks about an individual repenting or turning around. And we're going to start, our text for tonight is going to be in Hosea chapter 11. You can be turning there. For those who don't know, Hosea was a prophet to the nation of Israel. And God commissioned him to actually take a prostitute named Gomer as his wife. And she was to represent Israel's unfaithfulness to God. And so much of Hosea is about Israel turning away from God, being unfaithful, pursuing other gods or pursuing false gods. But Hosea/God continues to pursue their wife, or continues to pursue Israel. They seek for reconciliation with their unfaithful partner. And so we come to chapter 11, and for this text, like I said, it will be our main focus tonight. And so we're going to read through most of chapter 11. And it begins in verse 1. It says, "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. But the more they were called, the more they went away from me. They sacrificed to the Baals, and they burned incense to images. It was I who taught Ephraim to walk, taking them by the arms, but they did not realize it was I who healed them. I led them with cords of human kindness, with ties of love. To them I was like one who lifts a little child to the cheek, and I bent down to feed them." And so God speaks of his history with Israel, and kind of references a few things from their past, calling them out of slavery, calling them out of Egypt. He talks about how he brought them out of Egypt, and he portrays them kind of as a child here, that he cared for them. He taught them how to walk, and he showed love to them. But Israel turns a blind eye to God. We know the history of Israel. They don't acknowledge that God is the one that has showed this love to them. They don't acknowledge God as the one true God. They turn away from him. And so God continues on in verse 5. He says, "Will they not return to Egypt? And will not Assyria rule over them because they refuse to repent? A sword will flash in their cities. It will devour their false prophets and put an end to their plans. My people are determined to turn from me. Even though they call me God Most High, I will by no means exalt them." And so he talks about their punishment that is due to come upon them because of their unfaithfulness and refusal to repent. He talks of other nations attacking and ruling over them, swords coming and destroying their gates. And so you get this sense of destruction, all because they've turned away from God. They've turned away from God, and so destruction is set to come upon them. They are due destruction. They're due punishment because of their sin. And verse 7 says, they are determined to turn from God. Verses 5 through 7 are what Israel deserves for their unfaithfulness. But in verse 8, God presents an alternative option. Verse 8, "How can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I hand you over, Israel? How can I treat you like Admah? How can I make you like Zeboim? My heart is changed within me. All my compassion is aroused. I will not carry out my fierce anger, nor will I devastate Ephraim again, for I am God and not a man, the Holy One among you. I will not come against their cities." In this section right here, these two verses, God talks about how his heart has changed within him, and he shows compassion to Israel. He says he will not carry out his fierce anger, for he is God, not man. Mankind shows punishment when faced with unfaithfulness. Our gut reaction as humans is to get eye for an eye, to punish those who do harm to us or do wrong against us. But God exhibits all emotions in perfect balance. Just as God shows anger and wrath perfectly, he also at the same time has love and compassion in perfect balance for his people. Continuing on in verse 10 and 11, "They will follow the Lord. He will roar like a lion. When he roars, his children will come trembling from the west. They will come from Egypt, trembling like sparrows from Assyria, fluttering like doves. I will settle them in their homes, declares the Lord." And so in these 11 verses of chapter 11, we see this word and idea of turn come up many times and in different forms. In verse 7, God talks about how his people are determined to turn away from him. That they're determined to go against God, to turn their back on God, to seek other false gods. In their sin, when they should be turning towards God, they are turning away from God. And then, when you expect God to also return an equal response and also turn away from Israel, in verses 8 and 9, it's actually God who turns toward Israel. Israel is the one that should be turning towards God, but God instead turns toward Israel. Israel is the one who should be repenting, but God is the one who repents from his anger and shows love and compassion. And this chapter, to me, when you realize just kind of what all is going on, that you've got Israel turning away from God, and you'd expect God to also turn away from Israel, but God actually turns towards Israel, while Israel's still turning away from God. You've got all this going on, and you get such a good description, I think, through this chapter of who God is and what his love really looks like. That God turns toward Israel so that they will follow the Lord. Verse 10, it says, so that they will come trembling back to God. God turns toward Israel so that they can repent and also turn back towards him. God pursues Israel so that they will turn and pursue him. And this is the message of the Bible as well. That when we are deep in sin and deserve death, when we deserve the swords at our gates, so to speak, when we deserve destruction, God pursues us. God turns towards us when we turn away from God, so that we, in turn, will turn back to God and also pursue God and live for him. Like I said, Hosea chapter 11 talks of an individual turning or repenting. You might have thought that it was Israel repenting, but like I said, it was God. God being the one who turns towards his people. God who shows a true characteristic of him, that while his people were sinning against him and turning away from him, God chose to turn towards his people. And the same is true in the New Testament. This is not just an Old Testament story, an Old Testament concept of God turning towards his people. The same is true in the New Testament, and the same is true today. John 3:16, we know it. God so loved the world that he sent his only Son. Romans chapter 5, verse 6. You see, at just the right time, when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Sounds a lot like Hosea chapter 11 right there. That while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. God demonstrates his own love for us. We've all sinned against God. We all make mistakes. We've all turned away from God. But God turns toward us by sending Christ to die for us. God makes the first move in the game, so to speak. God turns towards us. He shows love and compassion just like he did for Israel in Hosea chapter 11. Isaiah 53 verse 6, we all like sheep have gone away. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Isaiah 53, it's the prophecy of the suffering servant, which we apply to Christ. That says, we all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, turned away from God. But the Lord has laid on him, on Christ, the iniquity of us all. But God isn't the only one who turns. Like we looked at in Hosea chapter 11, the whole point for God turning towards the nation of Israel so that the nation of Israel wouldn't just continue doing what they wanted to do, so they wouldn't continue worshiping other gods, but it was so that they would also turn back towards God. Paul writes to the church in Colossae about this idea of repenting and turning towards God away from everything else. Colossians chapter 3, verse 1, since then you have been raised with Christ, set your hearts on things above. This idea of setting your hearts on things above, setting your hearts, pursuing that, setting your direction, maybe having to turn away from things that you once knew, things that you once loved or enjoyed, turning away from that and setting your hearts, your direction, your path on something else. So it says, set your hearts on things above where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. For you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature: sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. Because of these, the wrath of God is coming. You used to walk in these ways in the life you once lived, but now you must also rid yourselves of all such things as these: anger, rage, malice, slander, filthy language from your lips. Do not lie to each other, since you have taken off your old self with its practices and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its creator. We set our minds on heavenly things, like I said. We put our focus on Christ, where we no longer do what we want to do. We no longer live for ourselves. We no longer are living in this direction, but we turn so that we can then live towards God. We seek God. We pursue God. And part of that turning, part of that repenting, that turning around, doing that 180 is putting all the things of this world to death. And that includes taking off the old self and putting on the new self. And this idea of taking off the old self, it's much like you would take off some clothes and put on new clothes. If you're outside, you're working in the yard, perhaps. If you get mud on your hands, maybe you wipe them on your shirt, wipe them on your pants, or you've been sweating, especially when it's like a bajillion degrees like it is today out there. You've been sweating, and you come inside, and if it's like our house, the first thing your wife says is, you need to go take a shower and change your clothes. And, because that's how we are in a society. We don't like to be filthy. We don't like to wear the smelly, stinky clothes. And personally, I don't like it when you all wear the stinky, smelly clothes around me. And so that's what it's this idea, you take it off and put on fresh, clean clothes. That's what he's talking about here, that when we become a Christian, that old self, we take those off and we put on the new clothes, the clean clothes. We put on that new self. And it's all part of that turning towards God. It's all part of repenting. That you turn from what might be comfortable. You turn from your past. You turn from all of what you might know. You turn from what might be familiar to you. But you turn to God. But why do we turn to God? What's the benefit? Why do we only do it to avoid punishment or consequences? Do we really only turn to God to get some kind of reward? Or is there some kind of deeper reason for turning towards God? Psalm 107, verse 1, it says, "Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. Let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story. Those he redeemed from the hand of the foe. Those he gathered from the lands, from east and west, from north and south. Some wandered in desert wastelands, finding no way to a city where they could settle. They were hungry and thirsty, and their lives ebbed away. Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. He led them by a straight way to a city where they could settle. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and his wonderful deeds for mankind. For he satisfies the thirsty and fills the hungry with good things." We turn to God because he first loved us, and he satisfies our hunger and thirst. And obviously, it's not a physical hunger or thirst that we're talking about. God satisfies and meets our deep spiritual needs. The spiritual yearning of looking and searching for something more meaningful than anything this physical world has to offer. You look around at our world and people are searching for something much more than just a typical day-to-day life of getting up 8 to 5 and going to work. People are looking for something more, wanting to know what the meaning of life is, having deep yearning for some kind of spiritual matter. It says, "For he satisfies the thirsty and fills the hungry with good things." God's love and a relationship with God is what truly satisfies that spiritual thirst, that spiritual hunger. Then Psalm 49, verse 7 says, "No one can redeem the life of another or give to God a ransom for them." The ransom for a life is costly. No payment is ever enough. Kind of sounds a little bit like a Christian theme of Christ dying for us, so that they should live on forever and not see decay. For all can see that the wise die, that the foolish and the senseless also perish, leaving their wealth to others. Their tombs will remain their houses forever, their dwellings for endless generations, though they had named lands after themselves. People, despite their wealth, do not endure. They are like the beasts that perish. This is the fate of those who trust in themselves and of their followers who approve their sayings. They are like sheep and are destined to die. Death will be their shepherd. But the upright will prevail over them in the morning. Their forms will decay in the grave, far from their princely mansions. But God will redeem them from the realm of the dead. He will surely take me to himself. The psalm talks about how the fate of all humans is death. We all go to decay. The things of this world don't matter. The things of this world all die. All physical things will eventually go away. The only thing that endures is God and having a relationship with him. Turning towards God and seeking his love is what truly matters. And so the invitation for tonight is really quite simple. Have we turned towards God? And are we regularly turning towards God? Are there things in our life that we need to turn away from, things we need to put to death, things that we need to take off from that old self, and then turn to God? Turn away from the things of this world and turn back towards God. If you'd like to begin a relationship with God tonight, if we can encourage you or pray for you in any way, please come now as we stand and sing.